there's something most people completely misunderstand about avoidant personalities. They think avoidants don't care. They think avoidants walk away without emotion. They think avoidants move on instantly. But psychologically speaking, that's rarely what's happening beneath the surface. What usually happens is this. The avoidant disconnects emotionally in order to avoid vulnerability. And the empath begins chasing harder. More texts, more reassurance, more understanding, more patience, more emotional labor. And at first, this dynamic creates an illusion of balance. The avoidant distances. The empath pursues. The avoidant withdraws. The empath compensates. But here's the dangerous part. The avoidant slowly becomes emotionally dependent on the very person they keep pushing away. Not because they consciously want intimacy, but because the empath becomes predictable emotional security. The avoidant starts assuming, no matter how distant I become, they'll still be there. And this is where the empath slowly loses themselves, because empaths don't usually chase out of weakness. They chase because they believe love means persistence. They believe understanding someone deeply will eventually heal the relationship. So they excuse the coldness. They excuse the inconsistency. They excuse the emotional unavailability. They tell themselves, they're just wounded. They're scared. They've been hurt before. And while compassion is powerful, excessive compassion without boundaries becomes self-abandonment. That's the part nobody talks about. An empath can become so focused on understanding another person that they stop protecting themselves. Now here's where psychology becomes fascinating. Avoidants often do not feel the full emotional consequences of losing someone immediately. Why? Because emotional suppression delays emotional processing. In the beginning, they may feel relief. Relief from pressure. Relief from expectations. Really. From emotional intensity. But then something unexpected happens. Silence. The empath stops texting. Stops explaining. Stops chasing. Stops trying to fix everything. And for the first time, the avoidant experiences emotional absence instead of emotional pursuit. That changes everything, because the avoidant was psychologically adapted to distance. They were not adapted to permanent loss. There's a major difference. Distance still keeps the connection alive, but detachment forces reality. And once the empath emotionally detaches, the avoidant loses access to the emotional safety net they took for granted. This is why many avoidants suddenly reappear months later. Not necessarily because they transformed overnight, but because the nervous system finally recognizes what disappeared. And here's another important truth. Avoidants are often highly observant. Even when they seem emotionally disconnected, they notice changes. Especially when the empath stops reacting. When the empath no longer begs. When the empath no longer seeks validation. When the empath becomes calm, focused, and emotionally unavailable themselves. That creates psychological tension. Because the avoidant expects pursuit. When the pursuit disappears, uncertainty appears. And uncertainty activates emotional reflection. Now suddenly, the avoidant starts remembering the kindness, the patience, the loyalty, the emotional depth, the unconditional support. Things they once minimized now become emotionally significant. Why? Because humans often recognize value more clearly after access is removed. That's not just relationships. That's psychology. And this is where the empath's transformation becomes powerful. Not revenge. Not manipulation. Growth. Real growth. The empath finally realizes, I should not have to destroy myself just to be loved. That realization changes everything. Because healthy love does not require emotional exhaustion. Healthy love does not require constant chasing. Healthy love does not require proving your worth every single day. The empath begins rebuilding identity. They reconnect with purpose. They rebuild self-respect. They strengthen boundaries. They stop romanticizing emotional inconsistency. And ironically, this is often the exact moment the avoidant becomes emotionally curious again. Because emotionally unavailable people are often most affected when access disappears. Not when pressure increases. That's why begging usually pushes avoidance further away. But emotional detachment? That forces internal confrontation. Now let's make something very clear. Not every avoidant comes back. And not every avoidant suddenly becomes emotionally healthy. Some repeat the same cycles forever. But the deeper lesson isn't about whether the avoidant returns. The deeper lesson is about what happens when the empath finally stops abandoning themselves. Because the empath's greatest power was never the ability to chase. It was the ability to love deeply. And once that love is redirected towards self-respect instead of emotional overextension, the entire dynamic changes. The avoidant feels the loss. Not because the empath became cruel, but because the empath became unavailable to dysfunction. That distinction matters. Emotionally healthy people do not fear boundaries. Only unhealthy dynamics depend on the absence of them. And many avoidants eventually realize something painful. The empath they lost was not too emotional. The empath was simply willing to invest emotionally in ways most people never will. That level of emotional loyalty is rare. And once it's gone, it's difficult to replace. Because genuine emotional safety cannot be easily replicated. Now here's the final psychological truth. The avoidant often regrets the empath most when they realize the empath no longer needs them for emotional closure. That's when the illusion of control disappears, because the chase is over. And for the first time, the avoidant is left alone with their own emotional reality. No distraction, no reassurance, no emotional rescue, just reflection. And reflection is where regret begins. Most people misunderstand avoidant personalities because they only pay attention to the behavior on the surface. They see distance, emotional withdrawal, inconsistency, or coldness, and they immediately assume the avoidant simply does not care. But psychologically, the situation is often far more complex than that. Many avoidants do feel love, they do feel attachment, they do feel an emotional connection. The problem is that deep emotional closeness activates fear inside them at the exact same time. To an emotionally healthy person, intimacy feels comforting. To an avoidant, intimacy can feel psychologically overwhelming. This is why avoidants often mistake emotional safety for pressure. The closer someone gets to them emotionally, the more exposed they begin to feel internally. Vulnerability. Liddy starts triggering discomfort instead of security. Love begins to feel dangerous instead of calming. And the moment emotional expectations increase, the avoidant nervous system interprets that closeness as a potential threat to independence, control, and emotional stability. This usually develops from earlier emotional experiences where vulnerability was associated with pain, criticism, rejection, unpredictability, or emotional suffocation. Over time, the avoidant learns to protect themselves by suppressing emotional dependency. They become highly self-reliant, emotionally guarded, and uncomfortable with needing other people too deeply. As a result, when someone genuinely loves them with consistency and emotional openness, the avoidant may subconsciously experience that love as pressure rather than safety. The empath often becomes confused by this dynamic. The more love, patience, reassurance, and understanding the empath offers, the more distant the avoidant sometimes becomes. His creates emotional confusion because the empath believes closeness should naturally strengthen the relationship. But for the avoidant, increased closeness often increases internal anxiety. They may begin feeling trapped, emotionally obligated, or overwhelmed by expectations that were never even spoken out loud. What makes this dynamic psychologically fascinating is that the avoidant is not always consciously aware of why they pull away. Many avoidants genuinely believe they simply need space or lost feelings. In reality, what they often lost was emotional regulation. The relationship became emotionally intense enough to activate fears they never fully healed from. Instead of confronting vulnerability directly, they create distance, because distance restores temporary emotional control. This is why avoidants sometimes seem emotionally calm after creating separation. The distance reduces the emotional intensity that was triggering their nervous system. But that relief is usually temporary. Over time, once the pressure disappears completely, many avoidants begin recognizing the emotional value of the person they pushed away. Unfortunately, by then, the empath may already be emotionally exhausted. The tragedy is that avoidants often push away the exact emotional safety they secretly need the most. Not because the love was unhealthy, but because true intimacy forces emotional exposure. And for someone who learned to survive through emotional self-protection, exposure can feel terrifying. The avoidant is not always running from the person. Sometimes they are running from the vulnerability the relationship awakens inside themselves. Empaths often enter relationships with the belief that love, patience, and emotional understanding can heal almost anything. They naturally sense emotional pain in others and instinctively try to reduce it. This becomes especially dangerous when they become attached to emotionally avoidant people. Instead of recognizing emotional distance, ants as a warning sign, the empath frequently interprets it as a call for deeper compassion. They begin believing that if they just love harder, explain themselves better, become more patient, or sacrifice more of their own needs, the relationship will finally feel secure again. This is how empaths slowly become trapped in the chasing cycle. At first, the empath usually notices subtle emotional inconsistency. The avoidant may become distant after moments of closeness, pull away during emotional conversations, or send mixed signals about commitment and connection. But rather than stepping back and protecting their own emotional well-being, the empath often moves closer. They start overgiving emotionally because they believe the relationship simply needs more reassurance, more understanding, and more emotional effort. The empath begins over-explaining their intentions so they are not misunderstood. They become hyper-aware of the avoidance moods, trying to say the right thing at the right time to prevent withdrawal or conflict. They sacrifice their own emotional boundaries in order to maintain peace and connection. Instead of asking themselves whether their needs are being met, they become consumed with making sure the other person feels safe, comfortable, and emotionally supported. Over time, this creates a psychologically exhausting dynamic. The avoidant pulls away, and the empath chases harder. The more emotionally unavailable the avoidant becomes, the more emotionally invested the empath often grows. This happens because uncertainty intensifies emotional attachment. The empath becomes trapped in a cycle of trying to earn emotional consistency that should never have required earning in the first place. Many empaths mistake emotional suffering for emotional depth. They believe the intensity of the struggle proves the relationship is meaningful. They tell themselves that the avoidant is simply wounded, misunderstood, or afraid of intimacy. While this may seem it's true, the empath often ignores a critical reality. Understanding someone's pain does not erase the damage their behavior causes. The chasing cycle slowly changes the empath psychologically. They begin losing touch with their own emotional needs because all their energy becomes focused on preserving the connection. Their self-worth may become tied to their ability to fix the relationship. Every small moment of affection from the avoidant feels emotionally rewarding because it temporarily relieves the anxiety created by emotional distance. This creates an unhealthy emotional dependency where the empath starts craving emotional validation from the very person causing the instability. Eventually, exhaustion begins replacing hope. The empath realizes they are carrying the emotional weight of the entire relationship alone. They are constantly adjusting, forgiving, waiting, understanding, and sacrificing while receiving only inconsistent emotional availability in return. Yet many empaths still struggle to leave because they become emotionally attached not only to the person, but to the potential of who that person could become. The painful truth is that love alone cannot heal emotional unavailability. No amount of chasing can force someone to become emotionally present before they are ready to confront their own fears and patterns. And the empath's deepest healing often begins when they finally realize that healthy love should not require constant emotional pursuit, self-abandonment, or endless sacrifice just to feel wanted. One of the most psychologically complicated parts of the avoidant-empath dynamic is that the avoidant often becomes comfortable inside the very relationship they seem to resist. On the surface, it may appear that the avoidant wants freedom, space, or emotional distance. But beneath that behavior, many avoidants quietly develop a strong sense of emotional security from the predictability of the empath's pursuit. As long as the empath keeps chasing, reassuring, forgiving, and returning after every emotional withdrawal, the avoidant begins subconsciously relying on that consistency while still maintaining emotional distance. This creates a dynamic where the avoidant receives emotional stability without fully confronting vulnerability. They may not openly express dependency, but psychologically they begin expecting the empath to remain emotionally available no matter how distant they become. The empath's constant effort becomes a form of emotional insurance. The avoidant learns that they can withdraw, become cold, delay communication, or create emotional space. Yet the relationship often remains intact because the empath continues trying to reconnect. Over time, this predictability becomes emotionally comforting to the avoidant nervous system. They may not consciously recognize it, but they start feeling secure in knowing the empath will likely return after conflict, continue initiating conversations, or keep fighting for the relationship. This allows the avoidant to experience connection without fully risking emotional exposure themselves. In many ways, the empath carries the emotional responsibility of maintaining closeness, while the avoidant controls distance. The avoidant often mistakes this dynamic for independence. They believe they are emotionally detached or self-sufficient because they are not openly expressing deep emotional needs. But true emotional independence does not depend on someone constantly chasing you to preserve connection. What is actually happening is emotional dependence hidden beneath emotional distance. The avoidant grows accustomed to the emotional labor of the empath without realizing how much psychological comfort they derive from it. This is why avoidants can sometimes appear calm or unaffected during periods of emotional imbalance. The empath's predictable pursuit reassures them at a subconscious level that the connection still exists. Even if communication becomes inconsistent or emotionally strained, the avoidant senses that the empath is still emotionally invested. That hidden reassurance reduces the fear of abandonment while still allowing the avoidant to avoid deeper vulnerability. Meanwhile, the empath becomes increasingly exhausted. The more the empath chases, the more normalized the imbalance becomes. The avoidant unconsciously adjusts to receiving emotional effort without needing to reciprocate at the same depth. What once felt like temporary distance slowly becomes the structure of the relationship itself. The empath works harder to maintain closeness, while the avoidant becomes more comfortable maintaining space. Psychologically, humans adapt quickly to patterns. Once the avoidant becomes used to the empath always returning, apologizing, understanding, or waiting patiently, the relationship starts feeling permanent in the avoidant's mind. They stop fearing the loss because the empath's behavior repeatedly communicates emotional availability, regardless of how disconnected things become. The avoidant begins assuming the empath will always be there. This is why the dynamic shifts so dramatically when the empath finally stops chasing. The avoidant was emotionally adapted to distance, but they were also emotionally dependent on predictability. The moment the empath emotionally detaches, stops pursuing, or begins redirecting emotional energy elsewhere, the avoidant loses the emotional structure they quietly relied on. Suddenly, the safety net disappears. What makes this realization powerful is that the avoidant often does not recognize the value of the empath's consistency until it no longer exists. The emotional comfort they once took for granted becomes visible only through absence. And for the first time, the avoidant may be forced to confront something they spent years avoiding. The reality that emotional security was never coming from distance alone. It was coming from the empath who kept choosing to stay. Everything in the relationship dynamic changes the moment the empath stops chasing. For a long time, the connection may have survived on the empath's emotional effort alone. The empath kept initiating conversations, repairing conflicts, offering reassurance, explaining feelings, forgiving emotional distance, and fighting to keep the relationship alive. The avoidant may have appeared emotionally independent during this time, but beneath the surface, they slowly became accustomed to the emotional consistency the empath provided. Even while creating distance, they subconsciously depended on the empath's pursuit to maintain emotional stability. This is why the shift becomes so psychologically powerful when the empath finally detaches. At first, the avoidant may not immediately understand what is happening. They are used to emotional cycles where distance is followed by pursuit. In the past, every withdrawal was eventually met with another attempt from the empath to reconnect. Every cold period as softened by understanding. Every silence was interrupted by emotional effort from the other side. The avoidant learned to expect this pattern without even realizing it consciously. But emotional detachment changes the pattern completely. The empath stops texting first, stops over-explaining, stops trying to fix every emotional imbalance, stops seeking reassurance, stops reacting emotionally to inconsistency. Instead of fighting for connection, the empath begins protecting their own peace. This creates something the avoidant is often unprepared for: emotional uncertainty. For the first time, the avoidant can no longer rely on predictable emotional access. The emotional supply they unconsciously depended on begins disappearing. And what makes this dynamic psychologically intense is that the avoidant often did not even realize how much emotional comfort they were receiving from the empath's constant presence until that presence is gone. The empath's pursuit acted like emotional oxygen in the relationship. It reassured the avoidant that connection was always available, even while they maintained distance. As long as the empath kept chasing, the avoidant never had to fully confront the possibility of true loss. The relationship remained emotionally accessible on their terms. But once the empath detaches, the illusion of permanent availability disappears. This is usually the moment the avoidant begins feeling emotional consequences they previously avoided. Silence becomes heavier. Distance no longer feels empowering. The absence of emotional pursuit creates psychological discomfort because the avoidant nervous system is suddenly forced into unfamiliar territory. Instead of controlling closeness through withdrawal, they are now experiencing what it feels like to lose emotional access altogether. Many avoidants initially suppress these feelings. They distract themselves, rationalize the breakup, or convince themselves they simply needed freedom. But emotional support. Eschen does not erase emotional attachment. It only delays awareness of it. Over time, the avoidant often begins noticing the absence more intensely. They remember the emotional support, the patience, the consistency, and the deep understanding the empath provided. Things they once viewed as too emotional suddenly become rare and irreplaceable. The empath's detachment also changes the power balance psychologically. The empath is no longer emotionally available for dysfunction. They stop rewarding inconsistency with endless understanding. They stop abandoning themselves in order to maintain connection. Instead, they begin rebuilding self-respect and emotional boundaries. Ironically, this emotional independence is often what finally captures the avoidant's full attention. The avoidant becomes unsettled because the dynamic no longer follows the emotional script they became comfortable with. The empath is no longer chasing, waiting, or emotionally revolving around them. That unpredictability forces reflection. The avoidant is left alone with thoughts and emotions they spent years escaping through distance. What hurts the avoidant most is often not anger or rejection. It is realizing the empath truly let go emotionally. Because once the empath stops chasing, the avoidant can no longer depend on emotional access without effort. And for many avoidants, that is the moment they finally understand the value of what they lost. One of the biggest misconceptions about avoidance is the belief that they never feel regret after losing someone important. People often look at the breakup itself and assume the avoidant has already moved on because they appear emotionally detached, calm, or even relieved. But psychologically, avoidants frequently process emotions very differently from emotionally expressive people. Their emotional reactions are often delayed, suppressed, and hidden beneath layers of emotional self-protection. This is why regret rarely hits them during the breakup itself. In many cases, regret arrives later, quietly, and in complete silence. During the breakup, the avoidant nervous system is usually focused on escaping emotional pressure. If the relationship felt emotionally intense, demanding, or vulnerable, creating distance can initially produce a feeling of relief. The avoidant may convince themselves that separation was necessary for peace, independence, or emotional control. Because avoidants often suppress difficult emotions instead of processing them directly, they can appear emotionally unaffected in the beginning. They distract themselves with work, routines, entertainment, or new experiences to avoid confronting deeper feelings underneath the surface. At first, the silence after the breakup may even feel comfortable to them. There are no emotional conversations to navigate, no expectations to meet, and no pressure to be vulnerable. The absence of emotional intensity temporarily calms the avoidant nervous system. This is why many people become confused when the avoidant seems fine immediately after losing someone who deeply loved them. But emotional suppression is not emotional healing. Avoiding emotions only delays them. What changes everything is time. As days and weeks pass, the emotional noise begins disappearing. The empath is no longer constantly reaching out, asking questions, seeking closure, or trying to repair the connection. The emotional energy that once surrounded the avoidant slowly fades away. And for the first time, the avoidant is left alone with an unfamiliar reality. True absence. This is where regret often begins. The avoidant was psychologically prepared for distance, but not necessarily for permanent emotional loss. While the relationship existed, even in an unhealthy form, there was still emotional access. The empath's presence created reassurance in the background, even during periods of conflict or withdrawal. The avoidant subconsciously trusted that the empath would continue caring, continue trying, and continue remaining emotionally available. But once the empath truly lets go, the emotional safety net disappears. The silence becomes heavier because it no longer feels temporary. The avoidant starts noticing the absence in ordinary moments, the lack of messages, the lack of emotional warmth, the disappearance of someone who consistently offered patience, understanding, affection, and emotional effort. Things they once took for granted begin standing out in painful detail. This delayed emotional processing is why avoidants sometimes reconnect months later. It is not always manipulation or boredom. Sometimes it is the nervous system finally allowing emotions to surface after enough emotional distance has been created. Without the pressure of immediate vulnerability, the avoidant finally begins reflecting on what the relationship actually meant. Memories start returning differently. Instead of focusing only on emotional pressure or conflict, the avoidant begins remembering the emotional security the empath provided, the loyalty, the consistency, the way the empath stayed even during difficult moments. What once felt overwhelming now feels rare. And this realization can be deeply painful for the avoidant because regret often arrives when it is already too late. The empath who once chased endlessly may now be emotionally detached, healing, and rebuilding their life. The emotional access the avoidant depended on no longer exists in the same way. This forces the avoidant to confront something they spent years avoiding: the emotional consequences of pushing away genuine connection. What hurts most is not always the breakup itself. It is realizing that someone who once loved deeply finally stopped waiting. The avoidant recognizes that the empath's love was not endless after all. And when that realization settles in during silence, reflection, and emotional isolation, regret becomes impossible to escape. One of the most powerful shifts in the Avoidant-empath dynamic happens when the empath finally begins healing. For a long time, the empath may have built their entire emotional world around preserving the relationship. They overgave, overexplained, tolerated inconsistency, and sacrificed their own emotional stability in hopes of maintaining connection. Their energy became focused on understanding the avoidant, fixing the relationship, and preventing abandonment. But eventually, exhaustion forces a turning point. The empath realizes that constantly chasing love is destroying their sense of self. This is where real transformation begins. Instead of focusing entirely on the avoidant's emotional needs, the empath slowly starts reconnecting with themselves. They begin rebuilding self-worth that was damaged through repeated emotional rejection and inconsistency. They stop measuring their value based on someone else's ability to give love consistently. For the first time in a long time, they begin protecting their peace instead of sacrificing it for emotional crumbs. This change is not loud at first. It happens quietly. The empath stops begging for reassurance, stops chasing conversations, stops trying to convince someone to care, stops explaining their worth to people determined not to see it. Emotionally, they begin withdrawing their energy from dysfunction. They still care deeply, but they no longer abandon themselves in the process. They start creating boundaries, rebuilding confidence, reconnecting with purpose, and developing emotional independence. What once felt impossible slowly becomes reality. The empath no longer needs constant validation from the avoidant to feel emotionally complete. And psychologically, this is often the exact moment the avoidant becomes unsettled. Why? Because the empath's growth becomes a mirror. As long as the empath was chasing, the avoidant could maintain emotional distance without fully confronting the consequences of their behavior. The imbalance in the relationship. P allowed the avoidant to avoid deeper self-reflection. The empath carried the emotional labor, absorbed the confusion, and continued fighting for connection even when the relationship became unhealthy. But once the empath changes, the emotional structure of the relationship collapses. The avoidant suddenly sees the empath differently. The person who once tolerated emotional inconsistency is now calm, emotionally grounded, and less reactive. The person who once revolved around the relationship is now focused on self-respect and personal growth. The emotional dependence the avoidant unconsciously relied on is gone, and without that constant pursuit distracting them, the avoidant is forced to confront their own emotional patterns more directly. This is what makes the empath's healing so psychologically confronting for avoidants. Growth exposes reality. The avoidant begins noticing what they lost through comparison. The empath's emotional maturity, loyalty, patience, and depth become more visible once access to them disappears. Traits that were once overlooked suddenly feel rare and irreplaceable. The avoidant may begin recognizing how much emotional safety the empath actually provided, even while they spent years resisting intimacy. But the mirror effect goes even deeper than regret. The empath's growth highlights the avoidant's unresolved emotional wounds. Seeing the empath heal forces the avoidant to recognize that the relationship did not fail simply because love was impossible. It failed because emotional unavailability was never confronted. The empath evolved emotionally, while the avoidant remained trapped in the same fear-based patterns of distance, suppression, and avoidance. This realization can create intense internal conflict for the avoidant. They may feel admiration, guilt, longing, confusion, or regret all at once. Not because the empath became someone entirely different, but because the empath finally stopped shrinking themselves to maintain the relationship. And that is what truly changes the dynamic. The empath no longer seeks permission to feel worthy, no longer waits endlessly for emotional consistency, no longer confuses suffering with love. Instead, they become emotionally unavailable to dysfunction. For many avoidants, this becomes the most painful realization of all. The empath they once assumed would always stay has finally chosen themselves. And in that moment, the avoidant is often forced to confront not only the loss of the relationship, but the loss of someone who genuinely loved them in ways that are incredibly difficult to replace.